Can a simple sketch truly unlock the most guarded heart in the world? This is the astonishing story of an orphan whose unassuming drawing reached a reclusive billionaire, forever changing both their lives. The profound impact of this one act proves that the most powerful connections often come from the most unexpected places. In a world where wealth can buy almost anything, there existed a man who possessed more money than most people could comprehend, yet owned nothing of real value. His name was Silas Blackwood, and he was a legend in financial circles, a ghost in social ones, and an enigma to everyone who had ever heard his name whispered in the corridors of power. With a net worth that exceeded the GDP of small nations, Silas had built an empire through ruthless business acumen, calculated risks, and an unwavering dedication to profit above all else. He was the kind of billionaire whose decisions could reshape markets, whose investments could make or break entire industries, and whose approval was sought by everyone from tech entrepreneurs to world leaders. But behind the impressive balance sheets and the staggering wealth lay a man who had become utterly disconnected from the very humanity that made life. Silas Blackwood was not simply rich. He was isolated, emotionally barren, and completely alone in ways that had nothing to do with the physical presence or absence of other people. He had chosen this path deliberately, methodically cutting away every relationship, every friendship, every connection that might distract him from his singular pursuit of financial domination. Love, compassion, empathy, these were weaknesses in his carefully constructed philosophy, inefficiencies that successful people could not afford. His mansion reflected this internal desolation with haunting accuracy. Perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, the Blackwood estate sprawled across 50 acres of manicured grounds, surrounded by walls that kept the world at a safe and acceptable distance. The architecture was a masterpiece of modern design, all clean lines and expensive materials, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the coastline. Every room was filled with priceless art, rare furniture, and objects that collectors would kill to own. The wine cellar alone contained bottles worth millions. The garage housed a collection of vintage cars that museums had tried unsuccessfully to acquire. The library contained first editions that scholars dreamed of merely touching. Yet for all its opulence, the mansion felt cold. The marble floors echoed with emptiness. The vast rooms seemed to swallow sound rather than embrace it. The artwork on the walls, despite its astronomical value, brought no joy, serving merely as investments that happened to be displayed. The furniture, though exquisite, was rarely used. The kitchen, equipped with appliances that professional chefs would envy, prepared meals for one. The dining room, with its table that could seat 20, had not hosted a dinner party in over a decade. The guest rooms, perfectly maintained, had not welcomed a guest in even longer. Silas moved through this monument to material success, like a ghost haunting his own life. His daily routine was as rigid as it was joyless. He woke at 5 in the morning, not because he was an early riser by nature, but because he had trained himself to maximize productive hours. His breakfast was eaten alone, while reviewing financial reports on multiple screens. His mornings were filled with conference calls, his afternoons with meetings conducted via video, his evenings with more analysis, more strategy, more planning. He spoke to dozens of people each day, yet had real conversations with none of them. Every interaction was transactional, every relationship professional, every exchange focused solely on business outcomes. The staff who maintained his estate had learned long ago not to attempt personal interaction. They moved through the mansion like shadows, performing their duties with quiet efficiency, then disappearing before their presence could be truly noticed. The housekeeper had worked for him for 8 years, and could count on one hand the number of times he had looked directly at her. The groundskeeper had maintained the property for a decade, and had never heard Silas comment on the gardens, despite the countless hours spent ensuring their perfection. The chef prepared gourmet meals that Silas barely tasted, eating mechanically while his attention remained fixed on whatever screen demanded his focus at that moment. There had been a time, though Silas rarely allowed himself to remember it, when things had been different. In his youth, before the billions, before the empire, before the walls both literal and metaphorical had been erected, There had been moments of genuine connection, a childhood friend who had understood him, a mentor who had believed in him, even a brief romance that had promised something beyond mere ambition. But these connections had been casualties of his rise to power, sacrificed on the altar of success, dismissed as distractions from the greater goal of financial supremacy. The friend had been cut loose when maintaining the relationship required time that could be spent building the business. The mentor had been discarded when their advice became, in Silas's estimation, outdated and sentimental. The romance had ended when she had asked him to choose between her and his obsessive work schedule, a choice he had made without hesitation, and he told himself, without regret. Each severed connection had made the next one easier to abandon. Each relationship ended had reinforced his belief that emotional attachments were liabilities, that true success required the kind of singular focus that precluded genuine human bonds. Over the years, this philosophy had hardened into something that resembled wisdom in his own mind, but that others might recognize as profound emotional damage. Silas had convinced himself that he was not lonely, merely focused. He was not isolated, simply selective. He had not built a prison, but rather a fortress that protected him from the messy complications of human emotion. He read about neuroscience and convinced himself that emotional detachment was a form of mental discipline. He studied philosophy and cherry-picked passages that seemed to validate his choices. He looked at his bank account and used his wealth as evidence that he had made the right decisions. But late at night, in those quiet hours before dawn, when even the most disciplined mind can wander, there were moments when the fortress felt like a tomb. Moments when the silence of the mansion seemed oppressive rather than peaceful. Moments when he would stand at those floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the ocean, and feel something that might have been longing if he had allowed himself to name it. These moments were brief, quickly suppressed, immediately rationalized away as temporary weakness or the effects of fatigue. Silas Blackwood had not become one of the wealthiest men in the world by indulging such thoughts. His reputation in the business world was that of a genius, but also of a man without mercy. He had destroyed competitors without hesitation, acquired companies and dismantled them without guilt, made decisions that had cost thousands of people their jobs without losing a single night of sleep. He was admired, feared, studied, and emulated, but never loved. He attended charity galas when it served his interests, wrote checks with many zeros when it provided tax advantages or positive publicity, sat on boards when it gave him access or influence. But actual compassion, genuine concern for the welfare of others, authentic desire to make the world better rather than simply more profitable, these were as foreign to him as the surface of Mars. People who met him described a man who looked through them rather than at them, whose handshake was firm but cold, whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He had perfected the art of appearing engaged while remaining completely detached, of seeming interested while feeling nothing, of projecting competence while experiencing no real satisfaction. He had become, in essence, a highly sophisticated machine for converting opportunity into profit, a calculating engine that happened to inhabit human form. The irony was not lost on those who knew his story, though Silas himself refused to see it, that a man who had everything most people spent their lives chasing felt nothing that made life worth living. He could buy any experience, travel to any destination, own any object, yet found no real pleasure in any of it. The penthouse in New York sat empty. The villa in Monaco was used once a year. The private island in the Caribbean had not been visited in 3 years. The yacht, custom-built to his specifications at a cost that could have built a hospital, remained docked, maintained by a crew that wondered if their employer had forgotten it existed. This, then, was the man whose meticulously ordered existence was about to be completely upended. This was the fortress that was about to be breached, not by a hostile takeover or a market crash or any of the catastrophes he had prepared for, but by something far more dangerous and unpredictable. This was the life that was about to be transformed by the last thing Silas Blackwood would ever have expected to affect him. A simple drawing made by a child who had nothing but still somehow possessed everything that Silas had lost. The day it happened started like every other day. Silas woke at his customary time, went through his morning routine with mechanical precision, reviewed the markets as they opened in different time zones, made several decisions that would shift millions of dollars from one column to another. He conducted his meetings, reviewed his reports, approved his strategies. The staff performed their duties. The mansion maintained its cold perfection. The routine continued unbroken. Nothing in the predictable rhythm of his existence gave any indication that this day would be different from the 10,000 days that had preceded it. Nothing suggested that the walls he had spent decades building were about to develop their first crack. Nothing hinted that a child he had never met was about to accomplish what armies of therapists, friends, and family members had failed to achieve. Nothing prepared Silas Blackwood for the moment when innocence would collide with isolation, when a simple act of creativity would challenge every assumption he had built his life upon. The stage was set, the fortress was about to be tested, and the man who thought himself impervious to human connection was about to discover that the heart, no matter how deeply buried or carefully guarded, never completely forgets what it means to feel. Across the city, in a neighborhood that existed in a completely different reality from the cliffside mansion, lived a child whose world was as small as Silas's was vast, yet infinitely richer in the ways that truly mattered. Her name was Lily Chen, and at 8 years old, she had already learned lessons about resilience, hope, and human kindness that most adults never fully grasp. She lived at Sunshine Grove Home for Children, a modestly funded orphanage that did its best to provide care, education, and love to the 32 children who called it home. Lily had arrived at Sunshine Grove when she was 5, after her parents died in a car accident that had left her physically unharmed but emotionally shattered. The first year had been the hardest. She had been quiet, withdrawn, spending hours staring out windows, as if waiting for someone to come take her back to the life she had lost. The other children had learned to give her space. The staff had been patient, understanding that grief in children manifests differently than in adults, that healing takes time, and rushing the process only makes it longer. But Lily possessed something remarkable, a core of resilience that even tragedy could not completely break. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she had begun to emerge from her shell. A smile here, a laugh there, tentative participation in group activities, and eventually genuine friendships with the other children. She would never stop missing her parents. The ache of their absence would always be part of her. But she had learned, with the help of the caring staff and the other children who understood loss in ways that fortunate people never would, that carrying grief did not mean abandoning joy. What made Lily special, what set her apart, even among children who had all faced their own hardships, was her capacity for seeing beauty in small things. While other children at the orphanage dreamed of being adopted by wealthy families or fantasized about lives of luxury and abundance, Lily found wonder in everyday moments. A butterfly landing on her hand during outdoor time, the way sunlight streamed through the common room windows in the late afternoon, the smell of cookies baking in the kitchen when the orphanage's limited budget allowed for such treats, the sound of rain on the roof at night, the warmth of a hug from Miss Sarah, the kind-hearted director who treated every child as if they were her own. Lily had discovered art as her primary means of expression. Drawing, specifically, had become her language for communicating feelings that words could not adequately capture. With nothing more than cheap crayons, recycled paper, and an imagination that refused to be constrained by her circumstances, she created entire worlds. She drew memories of her parents, preserving moments she feared she might forget. She drew the other children, capturing their personalities in simple but expressive lines. She drew her dreams, giving form to hopes that seemed impossibly distant, but that she refused to surrender. The orphanage had a small art corner, funded by occasional donations, where children could access basic supplies. Lily spent hours there, her small hands working carefully, her tongue often poking out in concentration as she focused on getting the details just right. The staff had noticed her talent early on. Miss Sarah had even reached out to a local art teacher who volunteered once a week, providing guidance that helped Lily develop her natural ability. For a child who had so little in material terms, art had become her wealth, her escape, her therapy, and her gift to others. The drawing that would change everything began as part of a school project. Lily attended the local public elementary school, where teachers did their best despite overcrowded classrooms and limited resources. Her third-grade teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had assigned a project for Kindness Week. Each student was asked to create something, anything, that expressed what kindness meant to them, and then to give that creation to someone who needed it. The project was designed to teach empathy, to encourage children to think beyond themselves, to foster a sense of community and compassion. Lily had approached the assignment with the seriousness she brought to all her art. For 3 days, she had worked on her drawing during every spare moment. At school during art period, at the orphanage during quiet time, even by flashlight under her covers after lights out, when inspiration struck and she could not wait until morning to capture an idea. The drawing was simple in execution, but profound in meaning. It showed 2 figures, one small and one large, holding hands under a tree. The sun was shining. Birds were flying. Flowers were blooming at their feet. But it was the details that made the drawing special. The small figure, clearly a child, was offering the larger figure, an adult, a flower. The adult's other hand was held over their heart, and above that hand, Lily had drawn a tiny heart with cracks in it. From the cracks, small beams of light were emerging, as if something broken was being healed. At the bottom of the drawing, in her careful, slightly uneven handwriting, Lily had written a single sentence that captured her entire philosophy of life, despite her young age. Even broken hearts can grow flowers. Mrs. Rodriguez had been moved to tears when Lily had shown her the completed work. The teacher had asked Lily who she intended to give it to, expecting the child to name a fellow student, or perhaps one of the staff at the orphanage. But Lily had surprised her. She wanted to give it to someone who really needed it. She had said, someone who had everything but was still sad. When Mrs. Rodriguez had asked how she would find such a person, Lily had simply shrugged and said that maybe the drawing would find them instead. What happened next was a series of events so improbable that if someone had tried to plan them, they would have failed. M.R.'s Rodriguez, touched by Lily's wisdom and wanting to help fulfill the child's wish, had mentioned the drawing to her husband that evening. Her husband worked as a courier for a delivery company that served the wealthier neighborhoods of the city. He had suggested, half joking, that they could send it to one of the mansion addresses on his route, someone who had material wealth but might appreciate a child's sincere gesture. The idea had seemed both silly and somehow perfect. Mrs. Rodriguez had helped Lily carefully package the drawing in a protective envelope. They had addressed it simply to someone who needs a smile, and included a brief note explaining that it was a gift from a student participating in a kindness project. The courier husband, Charles Rodriguez, had agreed to include it in his deliveries, planning to leave it at one of the grand estates on his route, perhaps at the gate or with security, never expecting anything to come of it. Charles had several stops in the exclusive Cliff Heights neighborhood on the day he carried Lily's drawing. The first few deliveries went as planned, but when he reached the Blackwood estate, he encountered an unusual situation. The regular security guard was absent, replaced by a temp who was still learning the protocols. When Charles explained, he had a personal delivery. The temporary guard, uncertain of procedures and not wanting to make a mistake, had simply buzzed him through to the main house rather than holding the package at the gate, as was customary. Charles had driven up the long, winding driveway past the immaculate gardens to the front entrance of the mansion. He had been instructed to leave packages at a designated location near the service entrance. But seeing no one around and wanting to ensure the personal item was not left outside, he had made a decision that would alter the course of 2 lives. He had approached the front door and rung the bell. Inside the mansion, Silas had been in the middle of a conference call, his attention divided between 3 screens displaying financial data. When the doorbell's chime had interrupted his concentration, he had frowned, checking his watch. No deliveries were scheduled. No meetings were planned. His assistant would have informed him of any expected visitors. The doorbell rang again, and with an irritation that was becoming his default emotional state, Silas had muted his call and gone to see who had the audacity to disturb him unannounced. Opening the door, he had found a uniformed courier holding a simple envelope. Charles, slightly nervous at the imposing figure before him and the obvious wealth surrounding him, had explained quickly that he had a personal delivery, a kindness project from a local school, and had thought someone at the residence might appreciate it. Silas had stared at the man as if he were speaking a foreign language. A kindness project from a school? What possible relevance could such a thing have to him? His first instinct had been to refuse it, to send the courier away, to return to his call and his data and his familiar world of numbers and strategies. But something about the man's nervous earnestness, combined with the sheer absurdity of the situation, had made him pause. Without saying a word, Silas had taken the envelope, given a curt nod, and closed the door. Charles, relieved to have completed his delivery without incident, had returned to his truck and driven away, never knowing the magnitude of what he had just set in motion. Silas had stood in his grand foyer, this envelope in his hands, feeling a mixture of confusion and annoyance. His unmuted conference call was waiting. Markets were moving. Decisions needed to be made. Yet here he was, holding something that had no place in his world, no purpose in his carefully organized existence. His rational mind told him to discard it immediately, to toss it in the recycling bin, and forget it had ever arrived. But curiosity, that most human of impulses, had stirred despite his best efforts to suppress it. He had walked to his study, the envelope still in his hand, and had set it on his massive desk while he finished his call. A conversation had droned on, discussions of market positions and risk assessments. But Silas had found his attention drifting to the simple envelope sitting among his expensive pens and leather-bound ledgers. It looked completely out of place, this cheap office envelope with careful handwriting on its front, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and power. When the call finally ended, Silas had sat in his chair, still holding his phone, staring at the envelope as if it might contain something dangerous. Which, in a way, it did, though not in any way he could have anticipated. He had picked it up, turned it over, noted the careful way it had been sealed. The handwriting was clearly that of a woman, neat and deliberate. The label read, "To someone who needs a smile." The phrase had struck him as almost offensively saccharine, the kind of greeting card sentiment that he had long ago dismissed as meaningless platitude. His fingers had hesitated over the seal. Part of him wanted to throw it away unopened, to reject this intrusion of sentiment into his domain of rationality. But another part, a part he had thought long dead, was curious. Who had sent this? Why had it come to him? What could possibly be inside that someone thought he needed? With a sharp movement that betrayed his irritation at his own indecision, Silas had torn open the envelope. Inside was a carefully folded piece of paper, the kind of inexpensive drawing paper that schools provided to students. There was also a brief note, which he had read first. It explained in simple terms that a third-grade student had created a drawing as part of a kindness project, hoping to bring a smile to someone who needed one. The note was signed by a teacher and had the official letterhead of a public elementary school he had never heard of. Silas had set the note aside, his expression one of barely concealed disdain. A children's drawing. This was what had interrupted his day? This was what someone had thought he needed? The presumption was almost laughable. What could a child possibly create that would have any relevance to his life, his world, his concerns? He had unfolded the paper with the kind of careful disinterest one might show when handling something mildly distasteful but requiring disposal. And then, despite every wall he had built, despite every defense he had erected, despite every emotion he had trained himself not to feel, Silas Blackwood had found himself staring at a simple crayon drawing that somehow reached across the gulf of his isolation and touched something he had thought long extinct. The drawing was objectively simple, a child's art with the imperfect lines and bold colors that characterized work created by young hands. But there was something in it, something in the composition, in the choice of subject, in the tiny details that revealed the artist's careful attention and sincere intent. The two figures holding hands, the flower being offered, the broken heart with light emerging from its cracks, The message written at the bottom in that careful, hopeful handwriting. Silas had set the drawing down on his desk, had turned away from it, had tried to return his attention to the screens, still displaying market data. But his eyes had been drawn back to it. He had picked it up again, studying it more closely this time, noting details he had missed in his first dismissive glance. The way the child had drawn grass as individual blades, rather than a simple green line. The careful shading that gave the tree dimension. The expression on the small figure's face, simple but unmistakably joyful. Something was happening, something that Silas did not fully understand and certainly could not control. The drawing had breached his defenses in a way that nothing had in years. It was not the artistry, though there was genuine talent evident in the work. It was not the sentiment, though the message was touching in its sincerity. It was something else, something about the entire gesture, about the idea of a child creating something beautiful and giving it away freely to a stranger, hoping only to bring a moment of happiness to someone they would never meet. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas felt something that was not anger, not calculation, not the cold satisfaction of a profitable deal. He felt, though he would not have named it as such, a crack in the armor he had spent so long forging. And in that crack, in that tiny opening in his carefully constructed fortress, something dangerous was beginning to take root. Something that looked suspiciously like the first stirring of a long dormant conscience. The drawing remained on Silas's desk for the rest of that day, an anomaly in his precisely ordered world. He had moved it aside several times, attempting to relegate it to the periphery of his attention, but found his gaze returning to it with a frequency that both puzzled and annoyed him. During calls between emails, in the brief moments when his mind would typically cycle through financial projections and strategic considerations, he found himself looking at those simple crayon lines, at that message written in a child's careful handwriting. That night, Silas did something he had not done in years. He broke his routine. Instead of working until his usual 11 o'clock stopping time before his precisely calibrated 6 hours of sleep, he had taken the drawing with him to the library, poured himself a glass of whiskey he would barely touch, and sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than most people earned in a year, studying a piece of elementary school art paper as if it contained the secrets of the universe. The library was his favorite room in the mansion, if such a term could be applied to any space in his emotionally sterile existence. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of books, first editions, rare volumes, collections that scholars would sacrifice much to access. He had read perhaps 1/10 of them. The rest were investments, appreciating assets that happened to look impressive. But tonight, surrounded by all this accumulated wisdom and wealth, Silas found himself transfixed by something a child had made with crayons that probably cost less than $1 for the entire box. He studied every element of the drawing with an intensity he usually reserved for financial documents. The tree caught his attention first. It was not generic, not the simple brown trunk and green circle that characterized most children's depictions of trees. This tree had character. The trunk was thick and strong, with visible texture created by different shades of brown crayon layered carefully. The branches spread out in a way that suggested shelter, protection. The leaves were individual marks of green, yellow, and even touches of orange, creating a canopy that felt alive, that seemed to dance with light. The two figures beneath the tree were where Lily's artistic sensitivity truly showed. The smaller figure, clearly representing a child, had been drawn with loving detail. The face was simple but expressive, with eyes that somehow managed to convey both innocence and wisdom, a combination that should not have been possible with mere crayon on paper, but that the young artist had nevertheless achieved. The child's posture was open, trusting, one hand extended toward the larger figure, offering the flower that had been colored with careful attention to shading and depth. The larger figure, the adult, was where Silas found himself lingering longest. This figure stood slightly bent, as if leaning down to receive the child's gift, to make connection at the child's level. The posture itself spoke of humility, of willingness to meet someone where they were, rather than demanding they rise to meet you. The face was less detailed than the child's, perhaps deliberately so, leaving room for any viewer to project themselves into that position, to imagine themselves as the recipient of such innocent generosity. But it was the detail over the adult figure's chest that had pierced Silas's carefully constructed defenses. The hand placed over the heart, and beneath it, visible through some artistic choice, it defied anatomical reality, but achieved emotional truth, the broken heart. Lily had drawn it with remarkable sophistication for a child her age. The heart was not shattered into pieces, not destroyed beyond recognition. Instead, it bore cracks, fractures that ran through it like fault lines in stone, suggesting damage but not complete destruction, brokenness but not beyond repair. And from those cracks, light was emerging. Tiny rays drawn with yellow and white crayon, pushing out from the fractures, as if something powerful was being released, or perhaps as if something healing was finding its way in. The symbolism was almost painfully obvious, yet somehow that obviousness did not diminish its impact. Here was a child's understanding of healing, of hope, of the possibility that what had been broken could become whole again, or perhaps become something even more beautiful because of its brokenness. The message at the bottom, "Even broken hearts can grow flowers," seemed to glow in the library's soft lighting. Silas read it again and again, each repetition striking him with unexpected force. The phrase was simple, almost childishly so, yet it contained a truth that his expensive education and decades of experience had somehow failed to teach him. Brokenness was not the end. Damage was not permanent. Even hearts that had been fractured, whether by loss or by deliberate neglect, retained the capacity for new growth, for beauty, for life. Something was stirring in Silas, something that felt dangerously like memory. He set the drawing down and walked to the window, looking out at the dark ocean, at the way moonlight played across the water's surface. He had not thought about certain things in a very long time, had trained himself not to revisit certain periods of his past, had locked away memories that served no productive purpose. But the drawing had somehow picked the lock, had opened doors he had thought sealed permanently. He remembered his mother, dead now for 15 years, and how she used to tell him that kindness was its own reward. He had dismissed this as the sentimental philosophy of someone who had never achieved real success, who had been content with a modest life teaching elementary school while he reached for something greater. But now, holding this drawing created by someone else's elementary school student, he wondered if his mother had understood something he had spent decades unlearning. He remembered his college roommate, David, who had tried to maintain their friendship, even as Silas had become increasingly obsessed with building his empire. David had invited him to his wedding. Silas had sent an expensive gift, but had not attended, claiming business commitments that were real, but not actually unavoidable. David had invited him to meet his children. Silas had declined, year after year, until the invitations had stopped coming. David had died 5 years ago. Silas had learned about it from a news article. He had not gone to the funeral. He remembered Julia, the woman who had loved him before wealth had transformed him into someone unlovable. She had seen potential in him, not for financial success, but for genuine goodness, for meaningful contribution to the world beyond mere accumulation. She had asked him once, during an argument about his increasingly long work hours, what he was building all this wealth for, what purpose it served beyond the number itself. He had not had an answer then, and he realized with uncomfortable clarity that he did not have an answer now. These memories came unbidden, unwelcome, stirred by a child's drawing that had somehow managed to excavate emotions he had thought successfully buried. Silas felt anger rising, not at the child or the teacher or the well-meaning courier who had delivered this intrusion into his carefully ordered existence, but at himself, at the vulnerability he was experiencing, at the weakness he was exhibiting in allowing something so trivial to affect him so profoundly. He walked back to the drawing, intending to tear it up, to destroy this catalyst of unwanted emotion, to reassert control over his internal landscape. His hand reached for the paper, fingers ready to crumple it, to dispose of this threat to his equilibrium, but he could not do it. His hand hovered over the drawing, trembling slightly, a tremor he could not remember experiencing, even during the most stressful business negotiations. Instead of destroying it, Silas found himself carefully picking up the drawing, carrying it to his bedroom, and placing it on his nightstand, where it would be the last thing he saw before sleep and the first thing he saw upon waking. The act felt ridiculous, sentimental, completely out of character. Yet he did it anyway, compelled by something he did not fully understand and could not rationally justify. Sleep, when it came, was troubled. Silas dreamed, which was unusual in itself. His dreams were typically either absent or forgettable, his subconscious as controlled as his waking mind. But tonight he dreamed of a tree, and beneath it a small figure offering him something he could not quite see. He dreamed of his mother's face, of David's laugh, of Julia's disappointed expression when he had chosen his ambition over their relationship. He dreamed of empty rooms in a mansion that suddenly felt more like a mausoleum than a home. He woke before his alarm, which never happened. The drawing was still there on his nightstand, catching the early morning light that filtered through his bedroom windows. In the pale dawn, the colors seemed even more vivid, the message even more insistent. Silas lay there, staring at it, feeling something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or perhaps simply the recognition that understanding was even possible. His morning routine felt hollow in a way it never had before. The financial reports he reviewed seemed less urgent. The conference calls he joined felt more performative. The decisions he made carried the same monetary weight, but somehow felt less meaningful. It was as if the drawing had adjusted his vision, had given him a new lens through which to view his existence, and through that lens, everything looked slightly different, slightly less certain, slightly more questionable. By mid-morning, Silas had made a decision that surprised even himself. He wanted to know more about the drawing, about the child who had created it, about the circumstances that had led to its creation and its unlikely journey to his doorstep. This curiosity felt dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of gravity, but he could not resist it. He called his personal assistant, Margaret, a woman who had worked for him for 12 years, and had learned to ask no questions about his requests, no matter how unusual. He described the drawing, explained how it had arrived, and asked her to find out everything she could about the school, the teacher, and if possible, the student who had created it. Margaret, to her credit, had simply said she would look into it, and had asked no questions about why a billionaire was interested in a child's art project. The investigation took less than a day. Margaret was nothing if not efficient. By evening, Silas had a file on his desk containing information that, in any other context, would have seemed mundane, but that he read with the intensity of someone discovering classified intelligence. The school was Lincoln Elementary, an underfunded public institution in a lower-income neighborhood. The teacher was Maria Rodriguez, 28 years old, in her 4th year of teaching, known for creative projects and genuine care for her students. And the child was Lily Chen, 8 years old, a resident of Sunshine Grove Home for Children. The file contained the basic facts. Orphaned at 5, parents killed in an accident. No living relatives willing or able to take her in. Bright student, showing particular aptitude for art. Well liked by peers and staff. No behavioral issues. No special needs beyond the obvious trauma of having lost her parents at such a young age. Silas read the information multiple times, each reading somehow making the drawing even more powerful. This child had every reason to be bitter, angry, withdrawn. She had lost more than most adults could bear to lose, had been dealt a hand that would have justified cynicism and despair. Yet somehow she had created something beautiful and had given it away freely, hoping only to bring happiness to a stranger who might need it. The contrast between Lily's circumstances and his own was almost obscene. She had nothing, materially speaking. She lived in an orphanage, wore donated clothes, ate institutional food, possessed few personal belongings. Yet she had created art that expressed hope, generosity, belief in the possibility of healing. Meanwhile, Silas had everything, more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, yet had created nothing of real value, had contributed nothing beyond financial transactions, had offered the world nothing but the cold efficiency of his business acumen. He thought about the broken heart in the drawing, about the light emerging from its cracks, about the message that even damage could produce beauty. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Silas Blackwood wondered if perhaps he was the one who needed healing, if perhaps his heart was the one that had been broken, not by trauma or loss, but by his own deliberate choices, by his systematic dismantling of every connection that might have saved him from the isolation he now inhabited. The question that formed in his mind was both simple and terrifying. Could someone like him, who had spent decades becoming what he had become, who had buried his capacity for genuine emotion under layers of calculated indifference, whose heart had been broken not by circumstance, but by choice, could such a person change? Could the cracks let light in? Could even a heart as deliberately hardened as his grow flowers? Silas stood in his study, the file in one hand and the drawing in the other, feeling something that might have been hope, or might have been fear, or might have been some combination of both. He did not know what he was going to do with this information, did not have a plan, could not predict where this path might lead. But for the first time in his adult life, Silas Blackwood was not thinking about markets or strategies, or the next deal to be made. He was thinking about a child he had never met, about a generous act that expected nothing in return, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, transformation was not impossible even for someone like him. The fortress had developed its first significant crack, and standing in that opening, uncertain and uncomfortable, but undeniably present, was the first tentative feeling of something that resembled authentic human emotion. A billionaire, who had thought himself beyond the reach of simple human connection, was beginning to discover that some doors, once opened even slightly, cannot easily be closed again. The decision to meet Lily Chen was not made impulsively. Silas spent 3 days wrestling with the idea, constructing and deconstructing arguments for and against such a meeting with the same analytical rigor he applied to major business decisions. The rational side of his mind, the dominant voice that had guided him for decades, insisted this was foolish, sentimental, a waste of time that would accomplish nothing productive. But another voice, quieter yet increasingly insistent, argued that he needed to do this, though it could not articulate exactly why. He had contacted the orphanage through official channels, speaking with Miss Sarah Crawford, the director of Sunshine Grove. The conversation had been awkward from the start. Silas was not accustomed to explaining his motivations, and Miss Sarah was understandably cautious about a wealthy stranger expressing interest in one of her children. He had explained about the drawing, about how it had arrived at his home, about his desire to meet the young artist, and perhaps thank her personally for her gift. Miss Sarah had been skeptical, as any responsible caretaker would be. She had asked probing questions about his intentions, had insisted on being present during any meeting, had made clear that Lily's well-being was her paramount concern. Silas, who was used to people accommodating his wishes without question, found himself in the unusual position of having to earn someone's trust to prove his intentions were sincere. It was humbling in a way he had not experienced in years. After several conversations and a background check that Silas had facilitated with unusual patience, Miss Sarah had agreed to arrange a meeting. She had spoken with Lily first, explaining that the person who received her drawing wanted to meet her and thank her personally. Lily, with the optimistic faith of childhood, had been excited by the prospect. Miss Sarah had arranged for the meeting to take place at the orphanage on a Saturday afternoon, in the common room where Lily would feel most comfortable and where staff would be present. The morning of the meeting, Silas found himself experiencing something he could not immediately identify until he realized, with some shock, that it was nervousness. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, had faced down hostile corporate boards with complete confidence, had made presentations to powerful people who could make or break ventures with a single decision. Yet the prospect of meeting an 8-year-old child had him second-guessing everything from what to wear to what to say. He had chosen casual clothing, or what passed for casual in his wardrobe, dark jeans and a simple sweater that probably still cost more than most people's monthly rent, but at least did not scream wealth the way his usual suits did. He had driven himself, which was unusual, having dismissed his driver for the day. The act of driving, of navigating streets he normally never thought about, of parking his expensive car in a neighborhood that was decidedly working class, felt strangely liberating, like a small act of rebellion against his usual routine. Sunshine Grove Home for Children was a modest two-story building that had clearly seen better days. The paint was faded, the playground equipment was old but well-maintained, the lawn showed patches where grass struggled to grow. Yet there was something warm about the place, something that spoke of genuine care despite limited resources. Children's artwork decorated the windows. A hand-painted sign welcomed visitors. Wind chimes hung near the entrance, their gentle sound a stark contrast to the silence of his mansion. Silas stood outside for a full minute before ringing the bell, aware that he was stalling, that crossing this threshold represented something significant, though he could not articulate exactly what. When he finally pressed the button, the door was answered almost immediately by a woman in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and an expression that was welcoming but wary. Miss Sarah Crawford extended her hand and greeted him with professional courtesy that barely masked her protective instincts. The common room where they waited for Lily was cheerful, despite its obvious age and wear. Mismatched furniture that had clearly been donated over many years created a comfortable if eclectic atmosphere. Children's drawings covered the walls. A riot of color and imagination that made Silas think of the gallery in his mansion, with its carefully curated and extraordinarily expensive art that brought him no joy whatsoever. A bookshelf held worn volumes that had been read and reread, their broken spines and dog-eared pages testimony to their value in a way his first editions, pristine and untouched, could never match. When Lily entered the room, led by one of the staff members, Silas felt his carefully prepared greeting die in his throat. She was small, even for 8 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing clothes that were clean, but clearly not new, probably donations or hand-me-downs. But what struck him most was her expression, open, curious, completely without the guardedness or calculation that characterized every interaction in his world. She looked at him with the directness that only children possess, seeing him not as a billionaire or a powerful businessman, but simply as another person. "Hello," Lily said, her voice clear and confident despite her small size. "Are you the one who got my drawing?" Silas, who had addressed rooms of hundreds without hesitation, found himself momentarily at a loss for words. "Yes," he finally managed. "Yes, I am. My name is Silas." Lily smiled, a genuine expression of pleasure that transformed her already pleasant features into something radiant. "I'm Lily. Did you like it? The drawing, I mean?" "I did," Silas said, and was surprised to find he meant it completely, without reservation or qualification. "I liked it very much." "It's beautiful. Thank you," Lily said, moving to sit on one of the couches with the unself-conscious ease of a child in familiar surroundings. "Mrs. Rodriguez said I should try to make something that would help someone feel better. I thought about what makes me feel better when I'm sad, and it's usually when someone is nice to me, or when I remember that good things can happen even after bad things." The simplicity of her explanation, the casual wisdom in her words, struck Silas with unexpected force. This child, who had experienced profound loss, was actively working to help others feel less sad. The contrast with his own approach to pain, which had been to wall himself off from feeling anything at all, could not have been more stark. "That's very thoughtful," Silas said, sitting carefully on a chair across from her, aware of Miss Sarah watching them from a respectful distance. "Can I ask you something? Why did you draw a broken heart with light coming out of it?" Lily considered the question with the seriousness children often bring to inquiries they deem important. "Well," she said slowly, "when my parents died, Miss Sarah told me that my heart was broken, but that broken things can still be beautiful. Like when you break a glass, and the pieces catch the light in different ways, you know? And I thought that maybe if a heart breaks, the cracks can let light in, and then flowers can grow there." The metaphor, delivered with such matter-of-fact sincerity, pierced through Silas's remaining defenses. Here was a child who had suffered genuine tragedy, articulating a philosophy of healing that he, with all his education and experience, had never managed to grasp. He felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates moving after being locked in place for geological ages. That's very wise, he said quietly. I think you might understand things that most adults have forgotten. Lily shrugged with the casual dismissal of a child, receiving a compliment she did not fully appreciate. Miss Sarah says I think too much sometimes, but I like thinking about things. It helps me understand why things happen. They talked for over an hour, though it felt both longer and shorter than that to Silas. Lily told him about her life at the orphanage, about her friends, about school, about her love of drawing, and how it helped her remember her parents without feeling so sad. She spoke about her memories, about her dreams for the future, about her hope that someday she might be adopted by a family who would love her. She was remarkably open, as children often are before life teaches them to guard their feelings and calculate their revelations. What amazed Silas was not just what Lily said, but how she said it, with complete honesty and without any apparent awareness of how her circumstances should make her bitter or resentful. She spoke of living in an orphanage with the same tone another child might use to describe their regular house. She mentioned wearing donated clothes without embarrassment. She talked about the limited resources at the home without complaint. Her entire perspective seemed oriented not toward what she lacked, but toward what she had, her friends, the staff who cared for her, her ability to create art, the small pleasures that brightened her days. In turn, Silas found himself talking about things he had not discussed in years, perhaps ever. Not his business dealings or his wealth. Those were carefully not mentioned in this context, but about his own childhood, about his parents, about choices he had made that had led him to where he was now. He did not tell her everything, did not burden this child with the full weight of his regrets and recognitions, but he spoke more honestly than he had in longer than he could remember. Lily listened with the same attention she would give to a story, occasionally asking questions that were surprisingly perceptive. When Silas mentioned that he lived alone, she had asked simply, "Don't you get lonely?" The question, delivered without judgment or pity, forced him to confront a truth he had spent years denying. Yes, he had admitted, the word feeling strange in his mouth because it was the first time he had ever acknowledged this reality aloud. Yes, I do get lonely sometimes. Maybe you need more friends. Lily suggested with the problem-solving directness of childhood. Friends make things less lonely, and they make happy things more fun, because you can share them. The observation was so simple, so obvious, yet it contained a truth that Silas had somehow managed to obscure behind layers of rationalization and deliberate isolation. Yes, he needed more friends. Yes, he needed connection. Yes, he needed to share his life with others, rather than experiencing everything in solitary confinement of his own making. As their conversation continued, something remarkable began happening. Silas felt himself relaxing in a way he could not remember experiencing in his adult life. The constant tension he carried, the perpetual readiness for confrontation or competition, the defensive posture he maintained even in supposedly casual situations, all of it began to dissolve. With Lily, there was no need for performance, no requirement to project power or success, no competition to win. She accepted him simply as he was, without judgment or expectation, and that acceptance created a space where he could begin to remember who he might have been before. Ambition and isolation had reshaped him. Miss Sarah, watching from her position nearby, saw something that surprised her. The man who had arrived tense and guarded was gradually transforming before her eyes. His posture softened. His expressions became more animated. He smiled, genuinely smiled, in a way that suggested he had forgotten how and was rediscovering the action. He laughed at something Lily said, a real laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it delighted the child. When it came time for Silas to leave, Lily asked if he would come visit again. The question caught him off guard. In his world, meetings were scheduled, relationships were transactional, connections served purposes. But Lily was not asking what he could do for her, or what benefit might come from continued association. She was simply asking if he would come back, because she had enjoyed talking with him, and thought he might have enjoyed it too. "I would like that very much," Silas said, and realized he meant it with a sincerity that would have been impossible for him to fake. If that's all right with Miss Sarah and with you. Lily beamed. It's very all right. Maybe next time you can tell me more stories about when you were little. And maybe I can show you more of my drawings. As Silas drove away from Sunshine Grove, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city, he felt fundamentally altered in ways he was only beginning to understand. The drawing had opened a door. But meeting Lily, experiencing her genuine warmth and uncomplicated acceptance, had pushed that door wide open. The fortress he had built around his heart had not just developed a crack. Part of the wall had actually crumbled, revealing landscape he had forgotten existed. He thought about her question, about whether he got lonely, and about his honest answer. He thought about her suggestion that he needed more friends, delivered with the casual wisdom of someone who understood instinctively what he had spent decades trying to deny. He thought about how she had shared her philosophy of broken hearts and growing flowers, offering him a framework for understanding his own emotional devastation that no therapist or self-help book had ever managed to provide. Most of all, he thought about how natural it had felt to simply talk with, to exist in her presence without armor or artifice, to be seen not as a billionaire or a businessman or any of the roles he had cultivated, but simply as a person. A lonely person, yes, a person who had made mistakes and carried regrets, but still a person, still capable of connection, still able to experience genuine interaction if he allowed himself to be vulnerable enough to try. The humanizing force had done its work. Lily Chen, with nothing but her innocence and her generous spirit, had accomplished what years of isolation had made seem impossible. She had reminded Silas Blackwood that he was, beneath all the wealth and power and carefully constructed defenses, still human, still capable of feeling, still able to connect, and perhaps, just perhaps, still able to heal. The changes in Silas Blackwood did not happen overnight, but they happened with a momentum that surprised everyone who knew him, most especially himself. The man who had spent decades building walls found himself, almost against his will, beginning to dismantle them brick by careful brick. It started with small things, gestures so minor that individually they might have seemed insignificant, but collectively they represented a fundamental reorientation of his entire approach to life. His first visit to Sunshine Grove became a second, then a third, then a regular Saturday afternoon commitment that he protected with the same fierce dedication he had once reserved for board meetings and conference calls. He would arrive with supplies for the art room, having learned from Lily that the orphanage's budget for creative materials was practically non-existent. Not expensive or flashy items, but quality crayons, good paper, paints that actually mixed properly, brushes that did not shed bristles. He brought these gifts quietly, without fanfare, and found genuine pleasure in watching the children's faces light up when they discovered new materials to work with. But more valuable than any supplies was his presence. Silas began spending time not just with Lily, but with other children at the orphanage, listening to their stories, showing interest in their lives, offering encouragement that was sincere rather than perfunctory. He was awkward at first, unused to genuine interaction, uncertain how to relate to children who had no concept of his wealth or status. But the children, with their remarkable capacity for acceptance, did not care about his initial discomfort. They saw only an adult who showed up consistently, who listened when they talked, who remembered details from previous conversations. Lily became something between a friend and a teacher for Silas, though neither of them would have used those exact terms. She continued to share her drawings with him, each one a window into her perspective on life, loss, hope, and healing. Through her art and her words, Silas began to understand concepts that had eluded him for decades. That vulnerability was not weakness, but courage. That giving without expectation of return was not foolishness, but wisdom. That connection with others was not a distraction from life, but the very substance of it. The transformation rippled outward from these Saturday visits, affecting every aspect of Silas's life. His staff at the mansion noticed the change first. He began greeting them by name, asking about their families, expressing interest in their lives beyond their functions in his household. The housekeeper nearly dropped her cleaning supplies the first time he asked about her daughter's college applications. The chef was stunned when Silas complimented a meal and asked about the recipe, actually engaging in conversation rather than eating mechanically while working. His business practices began to shift as well, more subtly, but no less significantly. Silas started asking different questions in meetings, not just about profit margins and market share, but about the human impact of decisions. When discussing a potential acquisition that would result in layoffs, he insisted on severance packages far more generous than legally required, personally overseeing the creation of a retraining program for displaced workers. His executives were baffled by this new concern for people who were, in the cold calculus of business, simply line items on a spreadsheet. He began using his wealth in ways he had never considered before, not just for tax advantages or strategic positioning, but for genuine good. The initial beneficiary was, naturally, Sunshine Grove. Silas established an endowment that would ensure the orphanage's financial stability, fund improvements to the facility, provide better resources for the children, and increase salaries for the dedicated staff who worked there. He did this quietly, through his foundation, without seeking recognition or public acknowledgement. But his philanthropy extended beyond the orphanage. Silas began funding programs that addressed root causes of the problems he was now seeing clearly for the first time. Educational initiatives in underfunded schools, mental health resources for children who had experienced trauma, arts programs that gave kids like Lily outlets for expression and healing, housing assistance for families on the edge of homelessness. Each initiative was researched carefully, implemented thoughtfully, monitored to ensure effectiveness, rather than simply writing checks and moving on. What made this philanthropy different from his previous charitable giving was his personal involvement. Silas did not just fund programs from a distance. He visited schools, met with families, talked with social workers and teachers and counselors. He listened to stories that broke his heart and inspired his determination in equal measure. He began to understand, in a way that no amount of data analysis could have taught him, the complex web of circumstances that created hardship and the equally complex interventions required to address it meaningfully. His colleagues in the business world noticed the change and reacted with a mixture of confusion and concern. Some whispered that he was losing his edge, going soft, allowing sentiment to cloud his judgment. Others, perhaps more perceptive, recognized that something profound had shifted in him and watched with curiosity to see where this transformation would lead. A few, who had known him longer or more closely, privately welcomed the emergence of a humanity they had suspected existed beneath his cold exterior, but had never seen evidence of. Silas himself was aware of the irony. He had spent his entire adult life pursuing wealth as an end in itself, believing that financial success would bring satisfaction and security. Now, with more money than he could ever spend, he was discovering that true satisfaction came not from accumulation, but from distribution. Not from isolation, but from connection. Not from power over others, but from empowerment of others. The realization was humbling and liberating in equal measure. The most profound transformation, however, was in his relationship with Lily. What had begun as curiosity about the child who had sent him a drawing had evolved into something that resembled family, though neither of them initially recognized it as such. Silas found himself thinking about Lily during his workday, wondering what she was learning in school, whether she was making new drawings, how her week had been. He looked forward to Saturdays with an anticipation he had not felt about anything in years. For Lily, Silas had become a consistent presence in a life that had been defined by loss and instability. She began to trust that he would show up when he said he would, that his interest was genuine, that his care for her was not contingent on her performance or behavior, but simply existed as a fact. This trust, slowly built through months of consistent interaction, gave her something she had not had since her parents died, a sense of permanence, of mattering deeply to someone. The conversation about adoption emerged gradually, organically, from both sides simultaneously. Miss Sarah had mentioned to Silas, during one of his visits, that Lily was theoretically eligible for adoption, but that finding families for older children was challenging, and that Lily's attachment to him had given her hope that she might have a permanent home someday. Silas had been thinking about the same thing wondering if it was possible, whether he could provide what a child needed, whether his transformation was real enough and deep enough to support such a commitment. He consulted experts, underwent the required evaluations and home studies, subjected himself to scrutiny that he would have found intolerable just a year earlier. The process was invasive and uncomfortable, forcing him to confront his limitations and work through his remaining emotional barriers. But he persisted, driven by a certainty that surprised him with its intensity. He wanted to be Lily's father, to give her the stable, loving home she deserved, to have her presence in his life permanently, rather than just on Saturday afternoons. When he finally approached Lily about the possibility of adoption, he was more nervous than he had been about any business negotiation. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but when the moment came, the practiced words fled. Instead, he asked her simply and directly if she would like to come live with him, to be his daughter, to have a family again. Lily's response was equally simple and direct. "Yes," she said, her eyes filling with tears that she did not try to hide. "I would like that very much." The legal process took months, but eventually, the day came when Lily Chen officially became Lily Blackwood. The mansion that had been a monument to isolation became a home. The rooms that had echoed with emptiness filled with the sounds of childhood, laughter and music, and the running of small feet. The walls that had displayed investment art became galleries for Lily's drawings. The kitchen that had prepared solitary meals now accommodated cooking lessons where Silas and Lily experimented with recipes, making messes and memories in equal measure. Silas enrolled Lily in a good school, made sure she had everything she needed, provided opportunities he was uniquely positioned to offer. But more importantly, he gave her time, attention, and the steady presence of someone who was genuinely invested in her well-being and happiness. He attended school events, helped with homework, listened to her stories about her day, celebrated her successes, and comforted her disappointments. He learned to be a father, sometimes fumbling, occasionally getting it wrong, but always trying, always present, always committed. Lily, for her part, continued to teach him lessons he desperately needed to learn, about patience and play, about finding joy in simple things, about the importance of expressing emotions rather than suppressing them, about forgiveness, both of others and of himself, about the resilience of the human spirit and its capacity for healing. She showed him, through her own example, that a heart could be broken and still grow flowers, that light could emerge from cracks, that love was not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all. The staff at the mansion, who had worked in silence for years, found themselves part of a household that felt alive. They heard conversations and laughter. They saw genuine affection between the man and the child. They witnessed small moments of tenderness that would have been unimaginable in the previous version of Silas Blackwood's life. The housekeeper smiled when she found crayon marks on a table, marks that once would have been considered damage, but were now evidence of a child's presence. The chef delighted in preparing foods that Lily enjoyed, receiving actual feedback and appreciation for meals. The groundskeeper created a small garden where Lily could plant flowers, watching her nurture growth with the same care she had shown in her drawing. But Silas's transformation extended beyond his personal life. His business empire began to reflect his new values. He divested from ventures that prioritized profit over people, invested in companies working to solve social problems, restructured his holdings to emphasize sustainability and ethical practices. He took seats on nonprofit boards, not for prestige, but to contribute meaningfully to causes he now cared about deeply. He used his wealth not just to make more money, but to create positive change, to open doors for others, to address systemic issues that perpetuated inequality and suffering. His relationships with former friends and colleagues were either renewed or definitively ended, depending on whether genuine connection was possible. David's widow was surprised to receive a letter from Silas, years after her husband's death, apologizing for his absence and expressing genuine regret for the friendship he had carelessly discarded. She responded graciously, and they established a tentative but real connection, meeting occasionally to share memories of David and to allow Silas to acknowledge the loss his choices had created. He tracked down his college mentor, now retired and in poor health, and spent a weekend at the older man's home, listening to wisdom he had once dismissed and apologizing for his arrogance. The mentor, with the grace of someone who understands that growth sometimes comes late, but is never too late, accepted the apology and spent hours in conversation with the man Silas was becoming, offering guidance for this new phase of life with the same generosity he had shown decades earlier. Silas even attempted to contact Julia, the woman who had once loved him, not to rekindle romance, but to acknowledge his mistakes and express gratitude for what she had tried to teach him. She declined to meet, but sent a letter that was kind if cautious, noting that she was glad he had found his way to a better version of himself and wishing him well. The closure was incomplete, but genuine, and it helped Silas make peace with that particular regret. The drawing that had started everything now hung in a place of honor in Silas's home office, professionally framed, but still visible, a daily reminder of the moment when his carefully constructed world had been challenged by a child's simple wisdom. He looked at it often, finding new meaning each time, the broken heart with light emerging from its cracks, the two figures holding hands under the tree, the flower being offered and accepted, the message that continued to guide him. Even broken hearts can grow flowers, and flowers were growing in ways both literal and metaphorical. Lily's garden flourished under her care, bright blooms that she tended with dedication, learning about patience and nurturing, about the cycles of growth and dormancy, about how even the smallest seed could produce remarkable beauty. But the metaphorical flowers were even more significant. The relationships that were being cultivated, the lives that were being touched, the transformation that was radiating outward from one moment of connection. The story of Silas and Lily became known in certain circles, though they tried to maintain privacy. Other wealthy individuals, inspired by this example, began examining their own lives, questioning their own isolation, considering their own opportunities to connect meaningfully with others. Orphanages and children's programs saw an increase in support from unexpected sources. The idea that even the hardest heart could be reached, that transformation was possible regardless of age or circumstance, offered hope to people who had resigned themselves to emotional stagnation. But the true legacy was not measured in dollars donated or programs funded, significant as those contributions were. The true legacy was the proof that human connection transcends all boundaries of wealth, status, age, and circumstance. That innocence can reach cynicism. That generosity can melt isolation. That a child with nothing material can offer gifts of incalculable value to someone who has everything. That the most powerful force in the world is not money or power, but simple, genuine, human love. Silas Blackwood, once defined by his wealth and his isolation, had become someone entirely different. Not perfect, not without ongoing struggles and occasional relapses into old patterns, but fundamentally transformed. The billionaire, who had thought himself beyond the reach of ordinary human emotion, had discovered that his heart, though damaged by his own choices, retained the capacity to heal, to grow, to flourish in ways he had believed impossible. And it had all begun with a single drawing, a crayon picture made by an orphan child who believed that broken things could still be beautiful, that damaged hearts could still grow flowers, that light could emerge from cracks if only someone was brave enough to let it in. That drawing had been Lily's gift to a stranger, but the transformation it catalyzed became Silas's gift back to the world, proof that it is never too late to change, never too late to open a closed heart, never too late to choose connection over isolation, love over indifference, humanity over the cold calculus of mere success. The orphan had unlocked the billionaire's heart with a single drawing, but in doing so, she had also unlocked something far more valuable, the possibility of redemption, the promise of transformation, and the enduring truth that the most meaningful wealth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the connections we forge, the love we give and receive, and the legacy we leave in the hearts we touch. 3 years after a simple drawing arrived at his doorstep, Silas Blackwood stood in the auditorium of Lincoln Elementary School, watching his daughter receive an award for her artwork. The irony was not lost on him. This was the same school where Lily had created the drawing that changed his life, where a teacher had encouraged a project about kindness, where a chain of improbable events had been set in motion that would transform two lives completely. Lily, now 11 years old, had blossomed in ways that filled Silas with a pride he had never imagined feeling. She was confident without arrogance, talented without conceit, kind without being naive. Her art had continued to develop, showing increasing sophistication while retaining the emotional authenticity that had made her early work so powerful. But more than her artistic talent, it was her character that amazed him, her capacity for empathy, her genuine concern for others, her unwavering belief that people were fundamentally good and that kindness mattered. As he sat among other parents, some of whom he now knew by name, having attended school events and parent gatherings that would have been unthinkable in his previous life, Silas reflected on how completely his existence had been reordered. The mansion was still grand, but it was no longer a fortress. The wealth was still immense, but it was now a tool for positive impact rather than merely a scorecard of success. The business empire still existed, but it operated according to principles that prioritized human welfare alongside financial returns. But the most profound change was internal, invisible to anyone who had not known him before. Silas had learned to feel again, to connect authentically with others, to find meaning in relationships rather than transactions. The emotional numbness that had characterized his adult life had been replaced by a full spectrum of human experience. Joy and sorrow, pride and humility, love and occasional heartbreak. He experienced all of it now. And while it was sometimes uncomfortable or even painful, it was infinitely preferable to the hollow existence he had inhabited before. He thought often about the journey that had brought him to this moment. How a man who prided himself on rationality and control had been undone by something as simple as a child's drawing. How someone who had believed emotional connection was weakness had discovered was actually the greatest strength. How a person who had everything money could buy had been living in poverty, of the most desperate kind, until a child with nothing had shown him what true wealth looked like. The lessons Lily had taught him, both explicitly and through her example, had become the foundation of his new philosophy of life. That vulnerability was not something to be avoided, but embraced, because it was only through vulnerability that genuine connection became possible. That giving without expectation of return was not foolish, but wise, creating a kind of value that no financial transaction could match. That the measure of a life was not in what you accumulated, but in what you contributed. Not in how much power you wielded, but in how much love you gave and received. He had learned that healing was not a destination, but a process, ongoing and sometimes difficult, requiring patience and persistence. The cracks in his heart, the damage he had inflicted through years of emotional neglect and deliberate isolation, did not disappear simply because he recognized them. But just as Lily had depicted in her drawing, light could emerge from those cracks. And in that light, new growth became possible. The flowers that grew in broken hearts were different from those that grew in undamaged soil, perhaps more precious because they represented triumph over adversity, beauty emerging from pain. He had learned that wealth, while it could solve certain problems and open certain doors, was ultimately just a tool, valuable only to the extent that it was used for meaningful purposes. In his previous life, money had been the end goal, the ultimate measure of success. Now it was simply a resource, no more inherently meaningful than time or talent or any other gift that could be deployed for good or squandered on meaningless pursuits. The billions in his accounts were the same numbers, but their significance had been completely transformed by his changed perspective. He had learned that it was never too late to change, that human beings retained the capacity for transformation, regardless of age or how deeply entrenched their patterns had become. His own life was proof of this principle. At an age when many people had settled into fixed patterns, when character seemed immutable and personality seemed established, he had fundamentally altered who he was and how he moved through the world. If change was possible for him, someone who had spent decades building walls and cultivating isolation, then it was possible for anyone. Most importantly, he had learned that the most powerful force in human experience was not intelligence or determination or wealth or power, but simple, genuine connection. Love, in its various forms, friendship, family, romantic partnership, community, was the force that made life worth living. All his achievements, all his success, all his wealth had brought him no real satisfaction until he had opened himself to authentic relationship with another person, starting with one 8-year-old girl who had seen past his defenses to the lonely person beneath. The award ceremony concluded, and Lily bounded over to him, her face glowing with excitement, clutching her certificate and a small trophy. "Did you see, Dad? Did you see?" The word Dad still sent a small thrill through Silas every time he heard it, a reminder of the miracle that had occurred, that this remarkable child called him father, that he had been given the incredible privilege of being part of her life. "I saw," he said, pulling her into a hug that would have been impossible for the old Silas, who avoided physical contact and viewed displays of affection as embarrassing weakness. "I'm so proud of you. Your artwork was beautiful, but what I'm most proud of is the person you are, kind and generous and wise beyond your years." Lily hugged him back fiercely. "I learned from you," she said, words that nearly brought tears to his eyes, because he knew the truth was precisely the opposite, that any wisdom he possessed had been learned from her, that she had been the teacher and he the student in their relationship. That evening, as Lily did homework at the kitchen table while Silas prepared dinner, a routine that had become sacred to both of them, he thought about the broader implications of their story. How many people were living lives of quiet desperation, isolated despite being surrounded by others, wealthy in material terms, but impoverished in ways that truly mattered? How many had built fortresses around their hearts, telling themselves they were strong when they were actually just afraid? How many had convinced themselves that success meant accumulation rather than connection, that safety lay in control rather than vulnerability? The story of how an orphan's drawing had unlocked a billionaire's heart was not just about two specific individuals, though their journey was unique to them. It was about a universal truth that transcended their particular circumstances, that human beings need connection. That isolation, regardless of how we rationalize or justify it, damages us in fundamental ways. That opening our hearts to others, despite the risks involved, is not optional but essential for a meaningful life. It was about the power of innocence and authenticity in a world that often rewards cynicism and calculation. Lily had reached Silas not through manipulation or strategy, but through simple, genuine expression of her belief in the possibility of healing and connection. Her drawing had not been designed to evoke a specific response or achieve a particular outcome. It had been an honest offering, a gift given freely in the hope that it might bring someone a moment of happiness. That purity of intention, that absence of ulterior motive, had been exactly what was needed to penetrate defenses that would have repelled more sophisticated approaches. It was about the unexpected sources from which wisdom can come. The world tends to assume that knowledge flows from the powerful to the powerless, from the educated to the uneducated, from adults to children. But Silas's story demonstrated that sometimes the most important lessons come from those we might least expect to teach us. An 8-year-old orphan had possessed understanding that a billionaire businessman lacked, had grasped truths about life that decades of experience and education had not taught him. It was about redemption and the possibility of second chances. Silas had made choices that damaged relationships, wasted opportunities, and ultimately left him isolated and unhappy. By conventional wisdom, those choices had consequences that should have been permanent, mistakes that could not be undone. But his story showed that while we cannot change the past, we can change our direction. That while regret may be unavoidable, despair is not. That it is possible to learn from our mistakes and build something better going forward. It was about the ripple effects of single acts of kindness. Lily had created one drawing as part of a school project, a simple assignment that took a few hours of her time. She could not have known or predicted the impact it would have. Yet that single act had not only transformed Silas, but had, through him, touched thousands of other lives. The programs he funded, the initiatives he supported, the example he set, all of these grew from that one moment of connection. One child's decision to create something beautiful and give it away freely had created waves that spread far beyond anything she could have imagined. It was about the difference between existing and truly living. Silas had been alive in the biological sense, breathing and functioning and moving through his days. But he had not been truly living, experiencing the full richness of human existence. The transformation Lily catalyzed was not just about becoming a better person in moral terms, though that certainly happened. It was about awakening to life itself, about discovering pleasures and satisfactions and meanings that had been available all along, but that he had been unable to perceive from behind his walls. As the evening progressed, and Lily eventually went to bed, as Silas stood in the doorway of her room watching her sleep, as he walked through his home that now felt warm and alive, rather than cold and empty, he understood with perfect clarity that he had been given an extraordinary gift. Not wealth, he had always had that. Not success, he had achieved that long ago. But something far more valuable, a second chance at life, an opportunity to experience what he had been missing, a path from isolation to connection. And it had all come from the most unlikely source imaginable. Not from therapy or self-help books or business coaches, or any of the resources his wealth could have accessed at any time, but from a child who had nothing except a box of crayons, a piece of paper, and a belief that even broken hearts could grow flowers, that even the hardest surfaces could be softened, that even the most isolated person could be reached with simple, genuine kindness. The original drawing still hung in his office, a daily reminder and a daily inspiration. But its lesson had expanded beyond that single piece of paper. It had become woven into the fabric of his life, informing every decision, shaping every interaction, guiding every choice. The broken heart with light emerging from its cracks was not just an image Lily had drawn. It was a map of his own transformation, a diagram of the process through which damage could become doorways, through which wounds could become windows, through which brokenness could become the very thing that allowed beauty to emerge. The message was simple but profound, one that the world desperately needed to hear and relearn continuously. That no one is beyond reach, that isolation is not strength but suffering, that vulnerability is not weakness but courage, that connection is not luxury but necessity, that kindness matters profoundly and practically, that love is not sentiment but survival, that we need each other not as abstractions, but as flesh and blood reality, as specific individuals who enter our lives and change us in ways we cannot predict or control. The orphan who unlocked a billionaire's heart with a single drawing had done more than save one man from his self-imposed exile. She had demonstrated a truth that applies universally across all boundaries of wealth and status and circumstance, that every human heart, no matter how guarded or damaged or deliberately hardened, retains the capacity to open, to feel, to connect, that the door is never locked so securely that the right key cannot turn it. And sometimes, often, that key is held by the person we would least expect, offered to us at the moment we most need it, if only we have the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to accept it. As Silas prepared for sleep that night, he experienced something he had not felt in his previous life: contentment. Not the satisfaction of a profitable deal or the pride of beating a competitor, but genuine contentment with life as it was, with relationships that mattered, with purpose that extended beyond personal gain, with a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. The fortress had been dismantled, the walls had come down, and in their place was something infinitely more valuable: a home, a family, a life worth living. The transformation that began with a simple drawing continued every day, in small ways and large, in private moments and public actions, in the ongoing process of learning to be human after years of trying to be something else. Silas Blackwood was not perfect. He still struggled sometimes with old patterns, still occasionally retreated into emotional distance, still had moments when the habits of decades reasserted themselves. But he always found his way back, guided by the lesson Lily had taught him: that even broken hearts can grow flowers, that light can emerge from cracks, that it is never too late to choose connection over isolation, love over indifference, life over mere existence. And somewhere in the world, other drawings were being created by other children, other acts of kindness were being performed by other innocents, other seeds were being planted that would grow in ways no one could predict. Because that is how transformation happens. Not through grand gestures or strategic plans, but through simple, genuine moments of connection, through authentic expressions of care, through the willingness to be vulnerable and the courage to reach out across the barriers we create. The orphan had unlocked the billionaire's heart, but in doing so, she had also unlocked a universal truth that we are all, ultimately, seeking the same thing: to be seen, to be known, to be loved for who we are, rather than what we have or what we can provide. And when we find that connection, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to receive it and generous enough to offer it, we discover what Silas discovered, that the true measure of wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the richness of our relationships, the depth of our connections, and the love we give and receive along the way. The drawing that changed everything was still just paper and crayon, but it had become so much more: a symbol, a reminder, a call to action for anyone who had built walls around their heart, a challenge to examine our own fortresses, to question our own isolation, to consider whether what we think of as strength might actually be fear, whether what we call success might actually be poverty in disguise. And most importantly, an invitation to open our hearts to the possibility that transformation is always available, that connection is always possible, that it is never, ever too late to choose love over isolation, and to discover, as Silas had discovered, that even broken hearts can grow flowers if only we let them.